So thank you for the introductions, thank you for all the sponsorships, and thank you very much for coming. So as Catherine said, over the next hour or so, I'm going to talk to you about a research program examining the impact of legally recognized same-sex marriage on GLBT people, same-sex couples, and their social networks. So I'm going to start off with just a little background about what's going on with same-sex marriage in the United States. What a lot of people forget is that same-sex marriage is actually not just an American issue. It's a global issue. There are countries in Europe that recognize same-sex marriage. There are countries in Europe debating same-sex marriage. So although it's not just an American issue, I'm going to focus today on the United States. So currently, this is the most current marriage map. These are states that have some form of legal protection and recognition for same-sex partnerships. So the states that are in the dark orange are states that are actually issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples. And as you can see, there are just 6 of those, right? And DC right now. States that have some color on this map offer some form of legal recognition and legal protection for same-sex couples. And you'll see your state, New Jersey, is there. New Jersey has civil unions. So it offers some form of recognition, but not a marriage license to same-sex couples. So this map sort of started in the United States in 2004. Massachusetts was the first state to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. And conveniently for me, as a relational scholar, I happened to be living there at the time, working at Boston College. And I thought, ooh, right? And so I started actually collecting the data that we're going to talk about today in 2003, 2004, right before marriage licenses started getting issued. And it's been a continuous research program up until now. So you're going to sort of see many studies over time. After Massachusetts started issuing marriage licenses, it sort of really opened up the floodgates on the fervor about same-sex marriage in the United States. So as you can see, some states followed Massachusetts in granting legal recognition of some sort. And then there were many, many states who went the other way on the issue. So this is a map showing current states that have some form of ban or prohibition against same-sex marriage, either in their state constitution or through some state law or statute, right? So the states that are in red are the ones that actually have constitutional amendments defining marriage in their state as that between one man and one woman. The states that are in orange have state laws, you can see my home state, Pennsylvania there, that prohibit marriage between same-sex couples. So as you can see, many, many more states right now on the not same-sex marriage side than on the same-sex marriage side. As you probably know, the debate is beyond a legal debate. It's a cultural debate about same-sex marriage in the United States. So since same-sex marriage came to the fore in Massachusetts, there have been countless movies, political debates, TV specials, celebrity weddings, right? Facebook campaigns, things having to do with chicken, right? All sorts of fervor going on about same-sex marriage. That is not my focus, right? What my focus is on the people that are actually having to engage in their relationships within the context or lack of a context for same-sex marriage. So what I think is lost in all of the political debates and the cultural fervor is actually thinking about GLBT people, their relationships, their families, their friends, their coworkers. So basically, GLBT people, same-sex couples, and what I call their social networks. And so my research, starting in 2004, has focused on how people who engage in same-sex relationships and how people who are in the relational lives of those people are dealing with this new either legal recognition, sometimes debates about the legal recognition itself. But most of the work I'm going to talk about today focuses on people who actually have the opportunity to have a legally recognized same-sex marriage and how that's affecting their relationship and their social worlds. Before I get into a lot of the details about what I'm going to talk about today in terms of individual research studies, I think it's important to take a minute and think about why would we want to know more about same-sex marriage. So as Dr. Green mentioned, a lot of my research focuses on communication and personal relationships. So I'm very interested in how couples, families, friends communicate with each other. One of the things that we know from the big body of research out there on communication and personal relationships is that relationships do not happen in a vacuum. Relationships happen in a context. That context has to do with the other relationships you have in your life, but it also has to do with the social structures that affect your relationship. So same-sex marriage is interesting to me as someone who studies personal relationships because it's part of the new context for same-sex relationships, right? Whether you're in a state that has legal recognition or not, if you are a member of a same-sex couple, this whole idea of same-sex marriage is influencing your relationship in some way. So if we're going to understand these relationships better, we need to look at the specific context of same-sex marriage to understand what's going on. The second thing that I find interesting from a research perspective about thinking about legally recognized same-sex marriage is that if you look at the long sort of history of work in communication, in psychology, in sociology, looking at same-sex relationships, what you'll find is many studies with one common theme, which is that, hey, what goes on in these relationships is not that different than what goes on in opposite-sex romantic relationships, except for one thing. And that one consistent thing is this idea of enacting a relationship that's stigmatized by the larger society. And so what that means is if you're in an opposite-sex relationship, you have opportunities to essentially have that relationship recognized, legally protected by the larger society. But if you're in an opposite-sex relationship, you have to find alternate forms of having people recognize your relationship and alternate forms of finding ways to protect your relationship, while at the same time perhaps bearing discrimination, various forms of harassment and abuse because of your sexual orientation and because of your relationship. So legally recognized same-sex marriage in the United States could possibly, for some couples, represent a shift from enacting their relationship in a stigmatized sort of environment to an institutionalized environment where you could seek protection and recognition through the same structures as your opposite sex relationship counterparts. And so my work has really thought about this not just as an interesting legal, political, cultural issue, but an interesting research issue as well. So I'm going to start just by briefly talking about methods. We don't have a ton of time today, and I don't know if you've been to a lot of academic lectures, but we can talk about methods for a long time, all right? And we can talk in a lot of details about methods and have a lot of debate about methods, which I'm happy to do individually. But today I really want to focus on the themes of sort of this body of research for you. So I'm going to give just a little brief overview of methods, which might be a disappointment to some and a relief to others, I don't know, all right? But all of the work I'm going to present today is qualitative data. And for some of you that know me well, you might be thinking, wow, really? Really, okay? And so one of the goals of qualitative data is to provide description, trying to provide rich description of the experiences, thoughts, feelings of the people who participate in our studies. The reason why to this point I've chosen to look at this data through a qualitative lens is because same-sex marriage was so new when this started that I felt like we really needed descriptions of what was happening before we could move to more quantitative approaches. All of the data that you're going to see today involves an inductive coding method. So what that means is that when I interview people or I have them complete open-ended surveys, when I get the data, what I do is I look for themes within that data. The themes that I'm looking for are not themes based on any previous research out there or coding schemes out there. I let the themes emerge from the data itself. It's called an inductive coding method. So that means that the themes that emerge are those that came from those participants' experiences and not from another place. The recruitment method used in all the studies that I'm going to talk about today is a snowball sampling method. What that means is that I initially find a group of participants, usually through listservs or membership lists of social groups in the GLBT community. And then once I get some participants, I put them to work. And so what those participants do, in addition to being generous enough to share their experiences with me as part of participating in my study, is I also ask them if they could help me find more participants for the study. So that's what we mean by a snowball sampling method. It's It's a pretty common sampling method within GLBT studies. All right, so that's the method overview. So the first study I'm going to talk about was the research that I did at the very beginning of same-sex marriage being legally recognized in Massachusetts. We found out in 2003 that same-sex marriage was going to become available. The marriage licenses weren't issued until, I think it was May of 2004. So in between everyone finding out that you were going to be able to get married and before people actually started to get married, I wanted to be able to sort of get a snapshot of what the GLBT community was thinking about this opportunity for legal recognition for relationships. And so I conducted a study. It was an open-ended survey study. And I really just wanted to get participants' general opinions, thoughts, expectations about same-sex marriage. So this is just a little bit of detail about the participants. There were 288 of them. 58% were from Massachusetts. When I started this study, I thought I would only get participants from Massachusetts. But because of the snowball sampling method, I was actually kind of lucky to get a more national sample in this particular study. So it's a snapshot of what people in Massachusetts and people not in Massachusetts, although I don't compare them because of the qualitative data, were thinking about this new way of recognizing same-sex marriages. So when I looked at the data, it was really interesting to me because there was a theme, and I'm not joking, that was mentioned by every single participant. That is weirdly rare, all right? And so that theme that was mentioned by all of the participants was this idea that with legally recognized same-sex marriage, there's the possibility for increased legal equality for not just couples, but the LGBT community as a whole. And so within that, what I call surface theme, there were other parts that were related to that. People talked about now being able to consider themselves a first-class citizen, where even though they were United States citizens, they had different relationship rights than other United States citizens, and that with same-sex marriage being legally recognized, that would no longer be the case. People were very excited about the financial security that would come with being able to have a marriage, right? There's a lot involved with people's insurance and death benefits and health benefits related to being married, which is actually very different for many people than having a civil union. And so, for example, my employer in Boston would not recognize any sort of domestic partnership or civil union or same-sex partner, but they had to recognize a same-sex marriage when it came to things like health benefits for partners. Because the deal was, you couldn't decide who among your employees were married if everyone had the same marriage license, right? And then protection for families. People having children, thinking about having children in the future, and the fact that for things with parenting rights, whether there's a birth parent or not, or an adoption parent, would be easier, more straightforward when it came to having a marriage rather than some other form of protection. So that's a surface theme. I wasn't terribly surprised by this theme. I was a little surprised that everybody mentioned it, but I wasn't so surprised that it was there. I sort of think about this theme of, you know, like those cake domes, like think Martha Stewart, right? Like there's the cake and then the dome goes over the cake, and that's like the surface theme, is the cake dome, right? But within that, like the cake or the brownies themselves, there were other things going on, all right? And these other things I describe as deeper dialectical tensions. If you're a communication student, you've probably heard this word dialectic before, right? When people in communication like me talk about dialectics, what we're talking about is a simultaneous force pulling in opposite directions, right? So these tensions in relationships that people have to negotiate, we look at it through communication, right? But the thing about dialectics that sometimes we don't think about as much as communication scholars or people interested in other types of scholarship is that if you look back at our theorists who gave us relational dialectics theory, Baxter and Montgomery, they didn't just talk about it on the dyadic level, just between two people, right? They actually talked about these dialectics as taking place within a cultural context, and that these different layers of dialectics could be affecting people's experiences of their relationships. And so that's what I had here within my data, right? Were these three interdependent levels of tension, right? One level having to do with same-sex partnerships themselves, one level having to do with the GLBT community as defined by my participants, and one level having to do with a tension between the GLBT community and heterosexual others. So I'm going to explain each of those things. So remember, my participants are people who identify themselves as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, right? And when they thought about same-sex marriage, they felt that same-sex marriage could be an opportunity for same-sex relationships themselves to be more serious, but at the same time, they felt that same-sex marriage could be an opportunity for these relationships to be more fanciful, right? On the serious side, what they were talking about was that couples would become stronger and closer because they had legal recognition. And they talked about institutionalization as a benefit for making relationships stronger. What they were really talking about was this idea that when we have commitment, there are things inside the relationship that keep us together. We might think of this as like, I don't know, our feelings for the other person, right? But that when we build relationships, there's also these external structures that get put in place that help us stay together. Things like owning a home together, or having a pet together, or having a kid together, or having a lease together. And one of those things is having a legally binding relationship like a marriage. And so that's what they were talking about with institutionalization. On the other hand, that simultaneous tension of seeing as relationships possibly becoming more fanciful, there was some concern. And remember, this was in the very beginning when everyone was like, oh, we're going to be able to do this, but no one quite knew what it was going to be like yet. There was some concern that people might get married for quote unquote the wrong reasons, right? And participants identified the wrong reasons to get married to be things like, oh, just because we can now, or because you want to be counted as part of this political movement, right? So there was some concern about that. In terms of the LGBT community itself, participants have felt that same-sex marriage could make the community stronger, but at the same time could make the community weaker, right? In terms of strength, participants talked about the idea that this was a validation for the community. With validation, what they were really saying is this means that we matter within society, right? Participants also talked about community unification as a result of legally recognized same-sex marriage, that this would show the community that we won on a political level and make the community stronger. At the same time, there was concern that same-sex marriage could weaken the GLBT community. And those concerns had to do with stigmatization and assimilation, right? The stigmatization here is not the way we would normally think about it with same-sex relationships. Normally we think about non-GLBT people stigmatizing same-sex relationships. This was a concern that if people could get married, people wouldn't take your relationship as seriously within the community if you weren't married. That the married people would become somehow more respected, important than the unmarried people. And assimilation, and this comes up later too, was the idea that, look, are we just trying to be like straight people? Are we losing something unique about the GLBT community by quote unquote mainstreaming when it came to relationships, right? And then lastly of these dialectical tensions, there was tension about the relationship between the LGBT community and heterosexual others. The others here could be straight people in general, or it could be straight people you actually knew, right, for these participants. So this was a healing injury dialectic. So at one way they saw same-sex marriage as something that could heal the relationship between gay and non-gay community members by helping to reduce homophobia and helping to gain acceptance. But at the other time, there was concern about injury, right? In the very beginning, when this data was collected, there was concern about, all right, is there going to be a lot of scrutiny of relationships, particularly people who got married because of all this attention that's happening, right? And could that be bad? And this comes up again later in later data too. The idea of visibility. There's still a fear that you can see in the data from this participants and that you'll see in data from some later participants that I'm going to talk about, that the more visible you are as a person in a same-sex relationship or as an LGBT person, that the more that makes it dangerous for you. That you're more open to attack, either physical attack, emotional attack, your job, right? So there was still that kind of fear that went along with this. So from this study, which was the initial study for me, I recognized, probably even more so than I thought it was going to be, that same-sex marriage was being seen as a new context, a new way of enacting relationships, that was going to affect not only people's same-sex relationships, but people's identities and relationships on the community level. And so from there, I wanted to continue on and look a little bit closer at couples themselves, right? And I was really interested in how couples were deciding whether to get married or not. I was particularly interested in this because when same-sex marriage was new, especially in the first couple years, and we're not that far into it, we're like 8 years into it right now, anywhere in the United States, and as I showed you, many people don't even have the opportunity at this point. But in the beginning, it was interesting to me because most of the couples that were getting married were long-established couples. People weren't just meeting and then going and getting married, right? These were couples that had been together for a significant amount of time, and therefore we can assume that they had established their way of being committed to each other and expressing their commitment to each other to others outside of this opportunity for same-sex marriage. So I was particularly interested in, now you have this new opportunity, how do you decide whether or not to take advantage of it by getting married? So in a first study dealing with this, I had an open-ended survey, 263 participants. 72% of them were married and 28% were engaged to be married. So these were all participants who had decided to get married, had already done it, or were preparing to do it pretty soon after collecting the data. And I really wanted them to tell me what made you want to do this, right? And what were some of the obstacles that you faced as you thought about getting married, right? So as we looked at their attractions to marriage, there's sort of three big themes here. And the percentages here are the percent of participants that mention something related to these themes, right? And so the first reason to get married, attraction to marriage, was civil public recognition, right? People felt like it would help them with things like health insurance benefits. People felt it would help with things like children. People wanted to make a public statement of their relationship. And people wanted to be part of political recognition for their relationships. So that was one of the attractions. The next attraction was to gain social network recognition. So acknowledgement from family for the relationship and acknowledgement from friends for the relationship. I'm going to come back to this family issue a couple times, but that's the beginning of it. And then there were personal attractions to getting married. This always makes me kind of laugh, right? That, 15% mentioned feelings for partner as a reason to get married, right? And then religious reasons for getting married as well. This feelings for partner thing being so low, the more I thought about it and the more I went through the data, you have to remember, they're not saying why I want to be in this relationship. They're saying why we chose marriage, right? From a relationship that was already established. So I think that's sort of what we're seeing there. So I also asked about the obstacles to same-sex marriage. Now remember, this is data from people who had all either gotten married or were engaged. So when they talked about obstacles that they had to deal with when looking at getting married, they had three major themes of obstacles. So the first were civil and public challenges. A small percentage of people had some unresolved previous marriages, usually opposite-sex marriages that they just never bothered to actually get divorced from officially because they were now with a same-sex partner or something like that, all right? And then legal recognition of same-sex marriage being limited was a challenge. There was a participant in this study that actually said something like, well, I feel like I'm not only marrying my husband, but I'm also marrying Massachusetts, right? Meaning that if we get married, there's only a limited number of places we can then move to that are going to recognize our marriage. And that's a challenge, all right? So, and then there were social network challenges. 4%, kind of a small group, had some lack of friend approval, but if you look, 41% of the sample mentioned a lack of family support for getting married. I'm going to come back to this when I talk about the next set of studies. All right, and then there were problems with weddings and marriages. Philosophical or political objections to marriage, these usually fell into the range of like feminist critiques of marriage as an institution, just not believing that the government should be in charge of recognizing or controlling anything about relationships, and difficulties with funding and planning a marriage or a reception. Weddings are expensive, right? And so there was kind of this challenge for people, it's 27%, thinking about, well, we've been together for 7 years. Are we going to spend $20,000 on a wedding at this point, right? And if we don't, are we going to feel like we cheated ourselves by just going to City Hall, right? So things like this. There were also in this data if you ever get to actually read the article and see some of the quotes, there were some issues about things like, well, we wanted to get engaged, but we didn't know who should ask first. We didn't know if we wanted rings or not. So some of these sorts of issues kind of came in as challenges, right? Like, we sort of went with like, how traditional or whatever do we want to be about this? Sort of a little side follow-up study for this. As I said, all of this data was gathered from people who had gotten married or decided to get married. Right? But I was also interested in people who had been together for a significant amount of time in their same-sex relationships and had decided not to get married. So I did a second study. This was an interview study, so I interviewed couples for this study, 37 same-sex couples who had decided not to get married, even though they lived in a location where they could have legally recognized same-sex marriage. And the cutoff for this is you had to be together for at least a year to be a part of this study. But if you look at the mean here, they were 3 to 24 years with an average 8 years length of relationship. So they've been together a while, right, and decided not to get married. And so I asked them, what were their reasons, what were they thinking about, what were their conversations about not getting married? As you'll see, some of these are themes we saw as obstacles for the couples who did decide to get married, right? So family of origin, resistance and rejection, either of the couple themselves, but more often, not of the couple, but of the idea of the couple getting married. So we're okay with you as a couple, we love your partner, but why do you have to get married? That's an issue for the family. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. Right? Those political issues with marriage that I already mentioned. There were issues of outness. Several people said, you know, if we get married, that means I'm automatically telling either people in my life that I haven't chosen to be out with. There were several people who were in the military at the time where that was a big issue, right? So there were issues with outness related to jobs and professions, the same financial issues that we talked about before. The idea that there wasn't a personal need for marriage, right? That we've been happy with the way we're doing our relationship all along, so we don't personally feel like we have to get married or want to get married. And limitations and uncertainty of legal recognition. So again, this was the idea that, well, if we go and get married and then we move, it's not really going to work, so maybe we'll wait, or maybe we just won't pursue that now. And then there was, in this data, we started to hear talk of uncertainty. By the time I collected this data, there had already been a lot of those marriage bans that I showed you already in the map, and people were starting to say, okay, we have it now. Are we going to continue to have it? Do we want to go ahead with this when it's so uncertain? So, as I've sort of been thinking about couples in this data, the more I talked to couples about their decisions to get married or not to get married, the more I was actually talking to couples about their families, right? And what was going on with their families and their relationships with their families surrounding this idea of same-sex marriage. So if you remember that statistic from the open-ended survey of the people who were getting married or decided to get married, 41% said that their family of origin was an obstacle for getting married. So I'm going to present to you some data from a study that's coming out soon, looking at discussing marriage with families of origin. This is data from couples, from same-sex couples. I'm currently collecting, working on data, talking to family members, but that data is not ready yet, so I'm going to talk about the data from the couples. Right? So this is also interview data where I interviewed married couples. I think a couple of them were engaged. Right, just a few were engaged. Most of them were married. About how did you talk to members of your family of origin about your decision to get married, right? And what I realized in these discussions, and again, this is inductive data, I realized that a lot of what people were telling me had to do with privacy management and privacy regulation, right? And so I framed this data within Petronio's communication privacy management theory, right? So the way this theory works is, there's a lot of details about it. I'm going to tell you the overview. Okay. So the overview of this theory is that when there's information about you, you think it's yours, right? But in reality, you share a lot of that information with other people, your partners, your friends, your family members. And so because we think that information is about us and it's ours, but in reality we're sharing it with others, we have to set up in relationships ways of managing private information and ways of protecting private information and deciding when we're going to share private information and who we're going to share it with. And that all of these things that we negotiate happen in a rules-based system within relationships. So we develop rules either implicitly or explicitly with these other people in our lives that share our personal information about how information is going to be handled and the spread of information is going to be handled, all right? And so I use that theory for this because it was really descriptive of what the couples were talking about as they talked about their decision to get married with their family of origin members, all right? So one way that same-sex marriage was affecting the management of private information within family units and between couples had to do with negotiating and concealing information about the couple, right? So there were participants talking about how the decision to get married and getting married changed how they decided to disclose things about them as a couple to their family members, right? There was a participant that described it as having to, quote unquote, go back and fill in, right? Things that they hadn't told family members before, now that they were getting married, they felt more like they wanted to share. There's often stories of how people got together that hadn't been previously shared with family members, right? There were other couples that talked about that now that they were getting married, they realized they were going to have to, in the future, share more details about themselves as a couple with their family to function as a married couple within the family, right? And then there was also changes in how family members themselves sought information about the couple from the people in the couple, right? I think the most vivid explanation of this one, there seemed to be a lot of moms that were now suddenly willing to ask about the possibility of grandchildren. And they weren't asking that before people got married or decided to get married. So we're talking about couples that have been together like 5, 6 years. It's never come up. Couples say, hey, we're getting married. And now moms are going, are we going to have grandchildren? What have you thought about that? Are you thinking of adopting? Is someone going to get pregnant? What about a surrogate, right? This is the conversations going on all of a sudden. Many couples were taken aback by this, right? Really surprised by this happening as a result of legally recognized same-sex marriage getting introduced into the family dynamic, right? And then the other set of ways that I saw legally recognized same-sex marriage affecting privacy management, information sharing within the families and the couples was negotiating, sharing news about the marriage itself. This was pretty powerful for some people. So couples had to decide in what way they were going to coordinate sharing information about their wedding, their engagement, their marriage itself. They had to negotiate that with their families, right? Do we want to be really traditional and send out announcements? Are we going to invite certain people as part of this? You know, are we going to have an engagement party? How is this going to work? Right? And so there were many negotiations about that. And then there were privacy dilemmas regarding identities for family members, right? And so this data essentially was about family members having to come out as having a gay, lesbian, bisexual family member, often children, right? And what really surprised a lot of the participants in this is that when they decided to get married, it was often the first time they were learning that, you know, their father's coworkers didn't know that they were gay and had a partner, or that their mother hadn't told, you know, the craft group that she goes to on Thursdays that their daughter was involved in a lesbian relationship. But now if you're getting married, you can't use those euphemisms that parents or other family members had been using for the relationship before. People don't marry their roommates, right? And so it became sort of an identity issue for the family members. And there was a lot of what we call turbulence about this, right? A lot of issues of people in the relationships feeling very hurt by the concealment about this, parents feeling very stressed and anxious about that they're hurting their child, but at the same time they feel that parts of their identity is being threatened. So I just want to read you a brief quote. This is from a participant named Lou, who says, my dad and I got in a huge fight one day, and he said, you're going around telling people my private business. And I said, what effing business? And he said that my son is gay. I screamed, Dad, it's my marriage, my life, not yours, right? So really some strength going on about these identity issues because of having to deal with negotiating, sharing information about the same-sex marriage. So, like I said, I'm continuing to work with families. I'm finding the family piece of this to be particularly interesting for me. But just to sort of wrap up, I just want to share 2 other bits of information with you, and then I'll be happy to take questions or anything else that you have about this. One of the things that you'll notice if you look at the academic literature on gay and lesbian relationships is that we use the word LGBT a lot, right? But we don't always include participants who fall in all of those categories of LGBT. Another thing you'll notice is that we tend to look at a certain age group. We tend to look at people who are between, say, 18 and 40, right? And sometimes a lot younger than that, right? To talk about relationships in general. And so in doing work about same-sex marriage in particular, there were two parts of the community that I think don't get a ton of attention that I wanted to specifically focus on to help me round out some of the picture. So one of those first groups were older same-sex couples, right? And I hope this doesn't upset anyone, but here I was defining older as 55 and older. Right? You gotta make a cutoff somewhere, right? And so why I wanted to look at this particular group of people is because that group will have a really rich history of civil rights issues for GLBT people. They probably grew up pre-Stonewall, may have had first initial relationships pre-Stonewall, and if you think about that, have had a lot of social change related to being gay or lesbian and being part of a same-sex relationship, all right? And so I was really interested in how they were dealing with this legal recognition idea and what they were thinking about it, how it was impacting their relationships. So this is another interview study, all couples who lived in Massachusetts in which at least one member was 55 or older. The age range for all of them was 55 to 73, with an average mean age of 63, almost 64, right? There were married and unmarried couples in this data, right? There were 22 married couples and 14 unmarried couples, and that comes out in some of their answers, some of the themes that they told me about what they were seeing with same-sex marriage and how it was affecting their lives. So this first group of data only came from the married couples, right? This theme of feeling an increased sense of security was only shared by the married couples. They talked about financial security, right? This is gonna help us with finances. They talked about relational security. It just feels good that we made this commitment to each other. They talked a lot about medical security, all right? The idea that now no one can challenge me when I try to make medical decisions for my partner, that we can make these huge decisions in life together, right? The next two sets of data came from both married and unmarried couples. So this idea that with same-sex marriage came an increased sense of recognition, both personal recognition, so people see us as a couple in a different way, and political recognition, that idea again that we matter, right, within the larger culture. Right? And there were also some misgivings, and these were same misgivings, if you remember, we saw them at the beginning, right, with the whole general community was thinking about what does same-sex marriage mean. We see this misgivings about, is this too much mainstreaming, right? Are we gonna lose something because of that? And this idea again that this could be dangerous, right? And so I'm just gonna, if I can find it, briefly read you a quote. Alice says, "We thought about getting married, but we tend to keep our private life private." And then the researcher, that's me, says, "How does not getting married keep your private life private?" And Alice says, "If you get married, it's a public statement for everyone, like registering yourself as gay down at City Hall." And her partner Tracy says, "We just have had trouble in the past with people who don't really know, and they find out about us. You see those nuts with the God hates gay signs down at the State House. We just as soon keep our private life private and just between those we are close to." So this idea that it could be dangerous, right, to get married came up then. So I was really interested in the historical perspective that they have. I don't have time to go through all that data, but some of the participants actually talked about seeing this, talking about different experiences that they had had, how they couldn't believe we came this far. Others talking about how we can't stop here, we still need to keep going. So some of that data is there. I also wanted to briefly touch on the B's in the LGBT, all right? As I started collecting more and more data with couples, what I started to notice was that many couples, one member of the couple would identify as gay or lesbian, and another member of the couple would identify as bisexual, right? And I started to wonder if there was anything going on in terms of bisexual identities and same-sex marriage. So again, this is interview data, mostly married couples, a couple engaged couples, and this is all female-female couples for this particular study. And I asked them again, in getting married, right, how has this affected your lives, your identities, your relationships, right? And so there was talk about marriage influencing self-image, right? Many participants talked about having legally recognized same-sex marriage available helped affirm their bisexual identity because they felt like they could make an equal marriage choice. If they were ultimately wanting a male partner or a female partner, they had equal kind of choices now in terms of protection. There was a lot of talk about what it meant to be a wife and have a wife, and just that idea of that term, the sort of implications of that term, and the idea of making that term your own, making being a wife what you want it to be rather than what you think other sort of loaded definitions comes with that, right? There was, same-sex marriage was seen as affecting the primary relationship between the couple, as either strengthening the relationship, and then some people talked about how it challenged the relationship. Strengthening the relationship was a lot of what we've already seen in other data. We feel much closer, right? We feel more protected. Challenges to the relationship, there was a lot of stress involved in deciding to get married, right? And planning weddings, and that's what they talked about. Social networks here is particularly interesting to me in this data. People talked about families. People always talk about families in my data when I talk to couples about same-sex marriage, about support and resistance from families. We've kind of talked about that. But only in this data set did this idea of lesbian friends in the social network come up. And part of when it came up was pretty much in a negative way, I have to say. It makes me kind of sad, right? People would talk about lesbian friends saying, oh, you're getting married now. Does that mean you're not bisexual anymore, right? Or even challenging couples before they decide to get married to say, what, you're not going to get married because so-and-so is bisexual, right? And sort of challenging the bisexual identity within the context of legally recognized same-sex marriage. And then they talked about the LGBT community, feeling an increased sense of belonging to the community because of same-sex marriage, right? That idea of unification sort of comes in here. Oftentimes, people who have bisexual identities sometimes feel a little bit like the community is not necessarily always an easy home for them, right? But it made them feel closer to the community by being bonded through marriage, right? But then also an idea of invisibility, right? For the fact that they are, quote unquote, a mixed couple. So a lot of people sort of talked about, well, now that we've gotten married, no one really sees me as bisexual. I feel like it's making being bisexual even more invisible, right? There was one participant who even said she wanted to go around people and say, this is not a lesbian marriage, because people kept calling it their lesbian wedding, right? And she wanted to say, but that doesn't really include me or reflect me. And so that's some of what went on with that data. So I just wanted to give you sort of a little bit of snapshot of some of the couples that we don't always talk about, right, as it relates to same-sex marriage. In general, it's kind of hard to sum up the whole research program in an in general way. But I think one of the take-home messages from the research program is that thing that I keep saying. Same-sex marriage is not just a political platform, right? It's not just a cultural debate. It affects people's lives, right? It affects their relationships with each other. It affects identities, right? It affects families. And there's still a lot of work to do for people like me to figure out what all of those effects are. So, thank you.
So we probably have about 10-ish minutes, more or less, maybe slightly less than that, for questions for Dr. Lannutti. So you want to gives her an opportunity to have a beverage as well. But and if we do end, please be sure to eat some things on the way out so that we don't have to take them back over to Skype. But questions for Dr. Lannutti?
Pam, so you really interesting stuff, and you the stuff that you have about families and how they disclose to families and talk about it with the families. Did you have anything come up in your interviews with the couples about their decisions to marry or not marry, about how they broached the topic in their communication or decided to raise it as an issue? Because it could be a matter of topic avoidance in some couples.
Right. With that specific data set, it's all people who decided to get married or are married already. I think almost everyone in that data set is married. And so I sort of, in the interview, went through, when you first decided to get married, how did you talk about it with your family? What did you decide to do? So some of that data is in there. It falls within those CPM themes.
Okay.
Thank you. It was fascinating to me to hear about this question of assimilation issue. I think those of us who are interested in same-sex marriage feel those rumblings underneath forward. It suggests that there's a hidden variable in the study, which maybe is a next article for you or something. But the idea, what is this juggernaut called opposite-sex marriage, and how do we define that as the thing to which we are assimilating, or what people hold as a stereotype of that opposite-sex marriage, which may in fact be quite much more diverse than we expect. But it seems that there is a kind of, that kind of Lacanian idea that there's something out there that we're approaching and we can't quite get to it, but it's there and it's defined.
Right. And I mean, I don't think that I really drew it out in this presentation. I don't know if it's drawn out even that much in the articles now that I think about it, but when the couples do talk about that assimilation, it's sort of like what you're saying. They talk about opposite-sex marriage, or usually what they call straight marriage, in a very stereotypical way. You know, in this very like, oh, there's all these expectations about gender roles, and someone's always, you know, oppressed by it, and that, you know, there's not that diversity of marriage in general for opposite-sex couples being recognized in these discussions about assimilation, at least not the way my participants talk about it. So I think it'd be interesting to explore on its own.
It seems like exploring that might actually have positive political ramifications. Because when you think about quote-unquote straight marriage in a less stereotypical way, in a more diverse way, you're actually acknowledging many more people's realities who actually vote. And I'll just make a point that we are 1 year into New Jersey's opportunity to overturn the vote of the governor to deny same-sex marriage. So these kinds of studies can actually point us in directions in how we can bring in the hearts and minds of other folks who make a difference in those kinds of decisions in our state.
I've started collecting some data. It's sort of brilliant, sort of not. Specifically talking to couples about financial issues and health issues related to same-sex marriage. And you see the same-sex couples, they're talking about things like, I didn't realize how much really benefit people get from being married. I didn't realize how much easier it is for them to do taxes. I didn't realize how automatic it is to get, you know, benefits from work for your partner. Because what happens with a lot of the, all of the same-sex married couples is, even if you're married within your state, the federal government does not recognize you as married. And so there's lots of stories coming out in this data. For example, there's a Massachusetts couple that I just talked to in an interview, and they were talking about what a pain in the butt it is to do taxes every year, because they file as married in Massachusetts and they file as single on their federal one. It's messed up the way they claim their mortgage interest deductions. One of them is a federal employee who can't cover her spouse on her benefits, even though her benefits are better, and the state that she works in sees them as marriage. Her federal government employer will not see them as married. And I think about, it's just another way to sort of think about what marriage means.
That's, we see the case that has just gone through the New York courts, that's going up to the federal, probably Supreme Court, in terms of the couple where, the same-sex couple where the woman would have to pay $350,000 in inheritance tax. And it does make me think about another variable or something. I wonder if you control for it, or if this is something that we need to think about from a civics point of view, which is is there a relationship between people who actually understand that there's a bottom line problem with not granting equal rights? When I talk with friends of mine who are like, well, give them civil unions, and I'm like, do you understand that's not the same? And when, to people who are in their 40s, who are supposedly educated and understand tax systems and so forth, they don't realize that there are these types of things. So I wonder, have you accounted for just knowledge of, kind of reflective of what it means to be married, and kind of a civics knowledge in your data? It
doesn't really come up that much in my data, because all of my data, at least in the stuff, I have a couple studies that have,
I guess with the families is where I'm,
thing. The families really don't talk about that. The families talk about sort of like what it means to have a gay marriage in the family. And how will I tell, my kids? And how will I tell the other people on the block? That kind of thing is what
And here's my stereotype coming through. I'm guessing the families who are resistant have certain assumptions about personal freedoms and not being taxed, and yet don't.
That never comes up in my data.
Yeah. Well, because they're not talking.
And all the rest of my data is usually with the GLT people themselves, and to this point, it's been mostly focused on relationship level, communication, identity, community involvement. This is the study that I was just talking about is the first one where I've tried to get to these like more the money issues and the health care benefit issues.
Yeah, and those institutions are created through them.
So let's see if we can take one more question, and then Dr. Lannutti will be up here for quite some time. So.
I have a question about gender. Now, this
Okay.
will make it a complex question about gender, but maybe you could comment just a little bit about maybe gender differences between same-sex, in terms of how they're viewing same-sex marriage between
Right.
Male-male couples and female-female couples.
I really don't have it in this data. Just because with the qualitative analysis, I'm really reluctant to start doing that variable level comparison. And so I haven't. But, sorry. Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned when they're talking to families about, when they come out, talk about marriages, and what are the reactions when they're telling other family members of something? In particular, I'm thinking about children. And how, did you get any stories about how
There is. There's actually
about children, how the reactions and so forth?
There is a lot of discussion about nieces and nephews in particular in that study. And what's interesting is you have to remember that these are not couples that are coming out about being a same-sex couple for the first time to their families. These are couples who have been established as a couple but are now talking about getting married. So there was variance. Some children had grown up understanding the partnership for what it was. There were other children that had not really grasped, depending on their age or how the family approached it. And so I actually didn't focus specifically on how do you talk to children, but it does come up in that data. I actually have a little note to myself as like, I have a lot of future study notes, but one of them is specifically about talking with kids. And your own kids, right? Many of these couples have their own children. And, every now and then the data will pop up, I haven't looked at it enough, where children keep asking things like, why haven't you gotten married? We can get married. Or why is it that so-and-so's parents can get married and you can't? So it'll flit up every now and then, but not enough to have been a theme. And so it's something I probably need to specifically look for.
Okay, so we'll be here for a few more minutes to address any questions that people have. Thanks again for coming. Please take food, and please join me again in thanking Dr. Lannutti and all of our sponsors.